few years ago, I wrote a column in my Black Agenda Report column about Theodore Roosevelt. And this was sparked by, I had watched a public television documentary about the Roosevelts. And, you know, and people like him, they are, they're subject matter because the person who does it obviously admires them. So I believe that this documentary covered up a lot of things. He was an open white supremacist. He talked about his white army, white navy rather, going around the world. He was an arch imperialist. He said white women were obligated to have babies and keep, he really did say that, keep white people in control of the world. So I wrote about this truth that had been covered up in this particular program. And a Black Agenda Report friend and supporter said to me, why don't you write about all the presidents? And I maybe impulsively said yes. I'd never written a book before. I probably didn't know what I was getting into. It's a lot of hard work. But so that is how it started. And this is what I came away with after spending a couple of years researching these 45 people. America's foundation as a settler colonial state tells us a lot about what has happened throughout history, and it tells us a lot about the present day. The country was founded based on genocide, first of the indigenous population, then of chattel slavery. And so the foundations of this country are very racist, and anti-Black racism is foundational. Of the first 12 presidents, 10 were slave holders. And this played a huge role in American history. And these are things that aren't discussed. So, for example, I was always taught that Washington, D.C. was a new city and it was built on the Potomac. But why build a new city and why locate it there? Well, they wanted a capital that was safely within those states that depended more on the plantation economy. So this new city was created wedged between Maryland and Virginia. When Washington was the first capital was New York City. Washington was inaugurated here in New York City. Then it moved to Philadelphia. But as a slaveholder, he had a problem. The state of Philadelphia had a law that said any enslaved person who was there for 6 months could become free. So Washington, and he did this in violation of that state's laws, he had to rotate the several hundred enslaved people that he and his wife owned. And so no one was allowed to stay in Philadelphia for 6 months. They'd send them back to Mount Vernon and bring someone else up. And it's that kind of history that is just not taught to Americans. And most historians, I believe, are guilty of wanting to defend the status quo, defend the system that we're in. So they are loath to bring up anything that makes their subjects, puts them in a bad light. So Abraham Lincoln never gave up his dream of sending Black people out of the country. He talked about it as late as a week before he was assassinated. And even people were told to admire, like FDR, lest we forget at the time, the Democrats were the party of the segregated South. And Democrats like Roosevelt would use them as their excuse for inaction. So there were decades where there was an effort to have anti-lynching legislation, but Roosevelt didn't do that either. And it was always, I wish I could, but I need Southern support. I mean, and that lasted up until the 60s. Kennedy was not a strong supporter of the civil rights movement. He first met with Martin Luther King in secret. His brother, Bobby Kennedy, was even worse. He hated the Freedom Riders, hated the March on Washington. And it was only the efforts of the people, this mass movement that wouldn't die, that got us the civil rights legislation under Johnson. So he gets credit for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but it was the movement from below which forced him to do it. And so we go on and on and on, and we see even Democrats. We see Bill Clinton, who gave a lot of power to the mass incarceration effort, who executed a black man, a mentally disabled black man during his campaign, who had this horrible photo op with black men in prison garb to make the case that he was tougher on crime, the Sister Souljah moment with Jesse Jackson, the welfare reform, so-called reform, which pushed millions of people into poverty. All of these things were done by Democrats. Obama was very conservative too. He bailed out the banks, but didn't bail out the people. His foreign policy of destroying Libya, the most prosperous country in Africa. And then we have the presidents, and Trump's not the first, who got support by making racist appeals. Ronald Reagan did it with stories of welfare queens and a strapping young buck with food stamps and talk of states' rights in Mississippi. Trump, the thing that makes him different is that he dispenses with the code words, the winks, the nudges, and he just came out and said it and was popular because of it. So, but here we are today, as I was saying before, we end up with these terrible presidents in part because all Americans are dissuaded from being politically active in any way other than voting. So Black people especially are now told the only thing we can be is passive observers and just wait to see who white people will vote for in the Democratic Party, and that's the one we should support. And there's no other Black politics left that's worth our efforts. And so we end up with Trump, and we could end up with him again. But I think the story of the 45 presidents and their treatment of Black people tells us a lot about the country and explains a lot about where we are here in the 21st century.
Absolutely. I thought it was a wonderful book. I read it cover to cover. It's one of those books that you just can't put down. And I thought right from the get-go, the first few sentences in your book are, children learn in school that George Washington's false teeth were made of wood. That is not true. Some of his dentures were made of ivory and metal, but some of them came from human beings he owned. And just right there from the get-go, you understand the legacy of racism that's really swept under the rug. Could you maybe just speak a little bit more about George Washington, because he is one of those presidents that's universally revered. Republicans and Democrats both look up to him. He's the father of our nation. There's kind of an understanding that, yes, he did own slaves, but that was the thing at the time, I guess, and that's kind of overlooked. And we're told not to focus on that so much, but the fact that he helped create this nation that was conceived in liberty and eventually ended up in providing liberty for everyone. So what would your response be to that narrative?
Well, the nation was founded based on white supremacy, and the story of the teeth, he had transplanted teeth that were taken from some of the people he owned. And this stuck with me because any of us who've had a tooth extracted, even today with pain medicine and modern medicine, it's brutal. And for somebody to take the teeth out of your mouth to, transplant them into someone else, it's horrible. But that's what chattel slavery was like, a physical brutality that was practiced by 12 different presidents. And but the stories about the cherry trees and the founding fathers are all used to keep us from asking questions. They are used to prop up the system. They are used to keep us from asking questions or demanding more. If you're told this is the best of all possible worlds, we're the best country, we're the greatest country, even today, it's, during the impeachment hearings there, every member of Congress, all the Democrats, even the Black people, it really was very distressing to me to see Black people who should have known better extolling the virtues of the founding fathers who were slavers. But that's what we're stuck with now. But we have to question it. We have to ask. We have to acknowledge that The nation was not conceived in liberty, it was conceived in genocide. And Americans are very quick to ask other people to atone for their sins. So we're always asked if the Germans have atoned for the Holocaust, and did the Japanese, have they apologized over the sex slaves during World War II? Well, the same thing could be asked of this country as well. And but people are loath to do that. And it's easier to talk about how wise and wonderful these people were who practiced this terrible, so many terrible cruelties. And actually, you know, it's interesting, that is always the excuse that so-and-so is a person of their times, which means you're supposed to shut up about something horrible they did. But there were people at the time who questioned slavery. There was a man named, he was Polish, Kosciuszko, who fought in the Revolutionary War. He was a slaveholder himself, but he questioned it. And he, after many discussions with Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson always, his excuse was always money. I can't afford to, you know, give up these people I own. So Kosciuszko left money in his will to Thomas Jefferson, and he said, use this money to free the people that you own. Well, he dies, he leaves this will, but Jefferson never did it. So I think it's important to know what a horrible man Jefferson was also, and also to point out that there were always questions. There were always, and these are the people who should be held up as heroes. Rather than cover up for people who did so many horrible things, I think it's important to talk about the people who went against the grain, the Kosciuszkos, the people who, I've been telling people since I've been promoting the book, if there's a white man from the 1800s you want to admire, it ought to be John Brown, who his raid on Harper's Ferry was an attempt to start a slave insurrection. And the insurrection failed, and he was caught and executed. But he hastened the beginning of the Civil War, which I believe was the only way for slavery to end. So those people who are loath to give up their heroes, my response is find new heroes. We have to have a new criteria for who we admire and respect. And it should not be these people who did such horrible things, who either actively participated in genocides. People ask me who my least favorite president is or who was the worst. I always say Andrew Jackson. But I think it's a case of bad and less bad, frankly, or those who just went along because it was expedient. Being racist is not a political loser in this country. And unless there's some pushback, they all fall into that to some degree or other, including Obama, who very often and still does scold Black people because he knows it's something white people like to hear. So that's my argument. Let's find new people to respect. Let's lift up those people who fought against wrongdoing. And let's start talking about the country we should have instead of we're still covering up. We still have this country that gives people a maximum of $1,200 when there's this economic calamity, but gives billions of dollars to corporations. And it's impossible to fight against that if you're always talking about how great America is. It's hard for people to see that and speak to that.
I did just want to touch on Abraham Lincoln, because there's this narrative around him that, you know, he freed the slaves, he sympathized with enslaved Africans and wanted them to be free, and you know, the Civil War led to the abolition of slavery. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation. So, what would your critique of Abraham Lincoln be?
Well, he was another liar. He would say things like, if slavery isn't wrong, nothing is wrong. But he was not against slavery. The Republican Party, this new party at the time, was devoted to stopping the spread of slavery into new territories. Some Republicans were abolitionists. They were called radical abolitionists. He was not one of them. He said he wanted to keep the Union together. That was more important to him than keeping slavery. He famously said if he could keep the Union together by keeping slavery, he would do that, or by getting rid of slavery, he would do that. But it was enslaved people themselves who pushed the issue. Once the war began, which the South started, by the way, once the war began, every time Union troops entered a region the enslaved people would rush for the Union line. So they're the ones who made it a war against slavery. And as I said before, Lincoln never gave up. His dream was to get Black people out of the country. And we're told that he said that in the beginning, but he changed his mind. He stopped saying it. He never stopped saying it. There was actually a colony in Haiti, a tiny island called Ile La Vache off the coast of Haiti, where 400 so-called contrabands, people who had fled slavery during the war, were sent. It didn't last long. They weren't well provisioned. Illnesses and death, and the survivors were brought back. But he signed this executive order, I guess you could call it that, the day before he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and he considered colonization to go along with emancipation. He wanted Black people to leave the country, and he never stopped saying that that's what he wanted. So yes, he was a smart man, overcame poor education, so many different things, and he became this great wartime leader. That's all true, but what I've also said is true. And but as I've said before, people, we have to tell the truth about everyone. And if someone's going to, get the vapors and faint because they want to think of Lincoln as some kind of a saint, well, too bad for them. Let's talk about the people who we should revere. Let's talk about the people, the radical abolitionists, because they did exist, the enslaved who freed themselves. Let's talk about these people who fought for justice throughout American history.
And just to return to Teddy Roosevelt, there is a narrative around him that he did break the mold and ending racism in some important ways. There's a story when he was the New York City Police Commissioner where there was a racist preacher who was coming to town, and he appointed a bunch of Jewish police officers to guard him. That was kind of his way of making a statement there. He also appointed the first Jewish cabinet member, Oscar Strauss, as the Secretary of Commerce and Labor. He also famously had a dinner with Booker T. Washington, and that was really seen as inappropriate at the time, having a Black man over for dinner at the White House. So again, there is this sort of myth around him that he helped end racism in the United States in important ways. So what would your response to that be?
Well, he did. The Booker T. Washington story is very funny. He was a, old money, noblesse oblige kind of guy. And Booker T. Washington was the flavor of the month Black person at the time. He was the person in charge of patronage for any Black person to get a decent job. So he invites him to the White House, but there was this uproar from the Southern segregationists, and neither man was prepared for the reaction. But at the same time, Roosevelt did something really quite shameful. A group of Black soldiers in Texas, once they were stationed in Brownsville, Texas, they were under constant attack. They were accused of a murder. And at the time, the Republican Party was the Black People's Party, lest we forget, still the party of Lincoln. He waited until after Election Day in 1906 to get Black votes for the Republicans. And then a couple of days later, he court-martialed all these men. And so that's also true. So, but I say just tell it all and let's debate it all. I think that's the way forward, not to hide anything, not to try to prop people up and pretend they didn't do things they actually did. And I think it explains something I touched on before about people being personalizing their political beliefs and their attachment to certain individuals. We seem to think that we have to love people and turn them into saints in order to support them or to respect them. And we see that a lot. So people are loath to talk about anything that would put their idol in a bad light. And that's something we have to change.
And then lastly, I just wanted to ask you about Lyndon Johnson, because he did sign these important pieces of civil rights legislation.
Well, I suppose you could give him credit for doing those things, but I believe there are millions of more people who deserve credit. But like a lot of people, even as he did the right thing with one hand, he didn't do the right thing with another. So, for example, in 1964, during the Democratic Convention that was in Atlantic City that year, there was a group from Mississippi, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, led by Fannie Lou Hamer, who came to the convention demanding to be seated instead of the segregated delegation. And they were under great pressure to go away, to disappear, to compromise. King, even Martin Luther King, was urging them to compromise. Lyndon Johnson was urging them to compromise. And when Fannie Lou Hamer was on primetime television talking about how she was brutally beaten by police in Mississippi, the Johnson administration cut her off the air. And said people thought he was going to talk about his running mate or something, but it was some BS about the 9-month anniversary of JFK's assassination, anything to get her off the air. And she and others were spied on. The FBI had them under surveillance, had King under surveillance, knew everything that was being said and planned. So there was a certain point, and even those presidents who would sometimes do the right thing, if a position was pushed that they felt that they did not want, they could behave in the same way. So Johnson would turn into the old school Southern segregationist that he always was. But it's the Fannie Lou Hamers who are the heroes of these stories. And so next time, 1968, the Democratic delegation from Mississippi was all black, or nearly all black, because of her. And but that's why it's so important to keep up the pressure on these people. That's why it's so important to have mass movements. We can't, I think we have to see politicians, even the ones we respect, we have to see them in a adversarial light, because there's so much pressure on them not to do the right thing. And the pressure they need from us to do the right thing cannot end. And we can't see ourselves as these passive observers, and every couple of years they let us vote, and that's the most we can do. And we can't be unrealistic, and we have to accept the lesser of the two evils, and we can't demand or think about anything better. And I think that's part of Bernie Sanders' appeal, that he dares to say, this is not the best we can have. We can have something different. And I think that's why there's so many people who are so attached to him. But as I said earlier, I hope they're not just attached to him, and I hope they're attached to the idea that we can have change in this country and have a country that really works in the interests of people. And I hope people who support him can rise to that occasion.